Welcome. I'm Dan Misla, founder of Catholic Climate Covenant. Thank you all for joining this webinar tonight for this conversation to kick off our third of three Laudato Si and the U.S. Catholic Church conferences with our co-sponsor, Creighton University. As we begin, let me first turn to our colleague, Paz, who will talk a little bit about the Spanish language translation that we have available for you.
You're on mute.
Buenas tardes, perdón, me había olvidado que me había muted. Soy Paz Artaza Regan y soy gerente de programa para la Alianza para el Cuidado del Clima. Les doy la bienvenida a todos nuestros amigos que hablan español, castellano. Esta información es para ustedes. So this information, everybody, is only for those that speak Spanish. Si están participando en este evento a través de la transmisión en vivo o en YouTube, no tendrán acceso a interpretación simultánea. La interpretación solo funciona si están participando a través de Zoom. Incluiremos la grabación de español en el correo electrónico que mandaremos en los próximos días. Para escuchar la interpretación de idiomas, vayan a la barrita de abajo y vean donde diga en el control que diga interpretación. Haga clic y busque el idioma que quiera escuchar, Spanish, castellano. Para escuchar solo el idioma interpretado, solo el español, haga clic en Mute Original. Original, bajen el volumen. Silenciar el volumen. Debe unirse al audio en la reunión solamente con la computadora. No puede tener interpretación si utiliza una llamada telefónica o de otra manera. Si necesitan más ayuda, pueden mandar un mensaje en la cajita esta que dice questions. Y si están en YouTube, pueden mandar un mensaje a info@catholicclimatecovenant.org. Gracias.
Thank you very much, Paz. In addition to Paz and Elena from the Covenant staff, Dan DeLeo from Creighton University is also with us tonight. They'll be managing the Q&A, so if you have questions, put those in the Q&A feature on the Zoom screen. And before we begin, just a little bit more housekeeping. This session is being recorded, and a link will be sent to you within 24 to 48 hours after the session's over. If you are on the Zoom platform, please type your questions, as I mentioned, in the Q&A box. If you are watching this on our live stream on the Covenant's YouTube channel, please email your questions to info@catholicclimatecovenant.org. Paz, Elena, and Dan DeLeo will comb through the questions and feed them to me. I may not be able to get to all of them, but we'll certainly try. The chat function is available for you to chat with others during the session. It should not be used to submit questions. Use the Q&A feature instead. And please note that you will not be able to save the chat. Okay, so let us begin, as we should with Catholic events, to open with a prayer. So let's take a moment to quiet ourselves, to be in God's presence, to be grateful for this day and for this opportunity to be together. And we pray, loving Creator God, we come to you this evening to ask for your guidance, wisdom, and support as we begin this conference. Help us to engage in meaningful discussions. Allow us to grow closer as a community of faith, so we may support each other in our efforts to become better caretakers of our common home. Fill us with your grace, dear God, as we set aside our own self-interest and take bold actions so that all may thrive on a planet and so that our planet may also be less threatened by our current neglect. We are especially mindful of those in poverty who suffer disproportionately from this same neglect. And continue to remind us that that all that we do here tonight and in the coming weeks is for the pursuit of service to all humankind and all creatures who also reflect your majesty and your love. We ask these things in the name of Jesus, our Savior. Amen. This biennial conference series is designed to equip and inspire Catholics to more deeply integrate Laudato Si and its creation care teachings into the U.S. Catholic Church. In the last of a three-part series, we will focus on the 7 goals of the Laudato Si action platform to encourage a greater understanding of the platform's 7 goals: the response to the cry of the poor, ecological economics, adoption of sustainable lifestyles, ecological education, ecological spirituality, community resilience and empowerment, and response to the cry of the earth. And encourage Catholic individuals and groups to enroll in the platform, providing them with a clearer path for accomplishing each of these goals. Catholic Climate Covenant is coordinating on behalf of the Vatican the Laudato Si action platform in the U.S. Catholic Church through its God's Planet initiative, and Creighton University is a platform signatory. So we're happy about that. And this is the website for the God's Planet website. We encourage you to go there and look at all of the great things presented in that on that website. So before we introduce our keynote speaker, it is my privilege to introduce Father Daniel Hendrickson, a Jesuit priest and president of Creighton University, our co-sponsoring organization. Father Hendrickson has served since 2015 as Creighton's 25th president. A Nebraska native, Father Hendrickson earned his BA in psychology and theology from Marquette University in 1993. And entered the Society of Jesus in 1994. He received his MA in philosophical resources from Fordham University, a Master's of Divinity degree from the Jesuit School of Theology at Santa Clara University, and an MA and a PhD from Columbia University. We are very thankful for Father Hendrickson's leadership on sustainability and integral ecology. Unfortunately, he was unable to be with us live tonight, but has graciously provided a video welcome. So please, let's turn to that.
Good evening. As president of Creighton University, I'm excited to welcome you to this third and final convening of Laudato Si and the U.S. Catholic Church, a conference series on our common home. For the past 4 years, Creighton has been excited to co-sponsor this conference series as an expression of our Catholic Jesuit identity. This year, we're eager to focus on the Vatican's Laudato Si Action Program, of which Creighton is a proud signatory. It was an instrumental framework for the development of the Sustainable Creighton Initiative, which will guide our academic, our operational, and our engagement efforts ahead of the university's sesquicentennial in 2028. This commitment to ecological preservation is rooted in the Jesuit charism of Magis, and has long been a prominent way in which our community can do more for the greater glory of God. It was as far back as 1990 when St. John Paul II described climate change as a moral crisis that requires urgent action, and in the years since, Catholic leadership has echoed this call to care for our common home. However, just as this continued call for prudent climate action is a source of hope today, we also hold a responsibility to inspire the next generation to be caretakers of our planet, particularly when we are confronted with challenges that just seem too difficult to overcome. Prioritizing science-based climate action will not be easy, but your presence at this conference is evidence to the commitment of addressing the ecological economics that urge us to consider not just the financial impacts of inaction, but also the social and environmental cost. In his 2021 Earth Day message, Pope Francis stressed that with climate change, there is no time to lose. Time is pressing. Tonight, as we open our Laudato Si final convening, I urge us all to heed the insights of our esteemed keynote speaker and commit to engage in thoughtful and prudent climate action within all Catholic institutions of which we are a part. In closing, I want to thank Catholic Climate Covenant, Dr. Cynthia Smergel, Vice President of Mission and Ministry at Creighton University, as well as her predecessor, Dr. Eileen Burke-Sullivan, for their collaborative efforts to lead this conference series. May these next few days be filled with thoughtful discussions, purposeful planning, and a rejuvenating focus on what we can each do as a shared community with a commitment to build a brighter future for everyone. Thank you again for your attendance and for having Creighton University as your host. God bless you.
All right, thank you. Now, can you see my screen again? So we're good? Okay. Wow, that worked. Amazing. So thank you, Father Hendrickson. We are enormously grateful for Creighton's support of this effort and for your superb witness to how Catholic universities can become leaders in rising to the challenges that Pope Francis outlined for us in Laudato Si. Now, I am hard-pressed to think of a more resounding kickoff to these next several weeks exploring the goals of Laudato Si of the platform than to welcome a woman with enormous global stature and respect. Christiana Figueres is an internationally recognized leader on global climate change. She was Executive Secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change from 2010 to 2016, assuming responsibility for the international climate change negotiations after the failed Copenhagen conference of 2009. She was determined to lead the process to a universally agreed regulatory framework. Building toward that goal, she directed the successful conferences of the parties in Cancun, Durban, Doha, Warsaw, and Lima, and cumulated her efforts in the historic Paris Agreement in 2015. Throughout her tenure, Figueres brought together national and subnational governments, corporations and activists, financial institutions and communities of faith, think tanks and technology providers, NGOs and parliamentarians to jointly deliver an unprecedented climate change agreement. For this achievement, Figueres has been credited with forging a new brand of collaborative diplomacy. Since then, Ms. Figueres has continued to accelerate the global response to climate change. Today, she is the co-founder of Global Optimism, co-host of the podcast Outrage and Optimism, and is the co-author of the recently published book, The Future We Choose, Surviving the Climate Crisis. If you read one book on climate change this year, it really needs to be The Future We Choose. It is chock full of wisdom, practical advice, and spirited cheerleading, urging us to redouble our efforts to secure a better future for the next generations. I'll forego reading all of the recognitions and awards she has received, but in reading her bio, this notation carries a pretty cool factor. In the natural world, a moth, a wasp, and an orchid have been named after Christiana. And in 2017, Costa Rica issued a commemorative postage stamp in her honor. That is very cool. She holds degrees from Swarthmore College, London School of Economics, and a certificate in organizational development from Georgetown University. She has received honorary doctorate degrees from the University of Massachusetts, Boston, Concordia University, Georgetown University, Cranfield University, Warwick University, University of Edinburgh, University of Bristol, Yale University, World Maritime University, and Smith College. She's the mother of 2 daughters and speaks English, Spanish, and German. Christiana will offer some opening comments, and then I will have an extended conversation with her. So ask your questions. If you are on YouTube channel, feel free to email your questions to info@catholicclimatecovenant.org. And I strongly urge you to keep your questions short and to the point, so it'll be easier for Paz, Elena, and Dan to sort through them. So, Christiana, I now turn this over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Dan. Thank you for that very extensive introduction. I usually say shorter introductions are better because we have more time for the conversation. But thank you so much for your generosity with that introduction. I actually would love to get to a more free-flowing conversation as quickly as possible. But before we get there, here is the tone that I would like to invite for the conversation today. We know that addressing climate thing is the right thing to do. We know that it is the moral thing to do. All we have to do is read Laudato Si or listen to any of His Holiness speeches on nature, environment, or climate change, and we have a very, very clear line on what we ought to be doing. So that is not under question at all. What I would like to add to that, without minimizing at all, but placing it side by side, is that addressing climate change is not only the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do. And I would like to invite us all to begin to change our mindset if we have the mindset that climate change is a burden, as a responsibility, and it's, expensive and it's difficult and, and it's a sacrifice and all of that. Honestly, I think we can look at things quite differently. And that's the invitation that I would like to lay out for you. Because is climate change a threat? Absolutely. Absolutely a threat. We have seen and we're witnessing the extreme weather events that are happening all over the world. In fact, even just recently in the United States, in New York. And if we continue along the path that we have right now, we would breach all planetary boundaries quite soon. In fact, the date that is established by scientists is only 7 years away, 2030. By 2030, scientists are screaming from the rooftops, we have to be at 1/2 the global emissions that we are right now in order to stand a chance of squeezing our way through a door that is closing very quickly, of being able to avert the worst of climate impacts. Now, if we don't do that, if we continue to emit the way we're emitting right now, by 2030, we will go through a portal that guarantees that we, our children, our grandchildren, and generations after that will live in a world of constant physical destruction and human misery that we cannot even imagine. And that is no exaggeration. That is scientific fact. So is climate change a threat? Is unabated, unaddressed climate change a threat? Most definitely. Is answering climate change, addressing climate change, a burden? Well, only if you choose to see it that way. And that is the invitation that I would like to have for the next while that we are together. How are you choosing to see our individual and collective responsibility on climate change? If you choose, but it is your choice to see it as a burden, of course, guess what? If you choose it, it will be perceived by you as a burden. But if you choose differently and you have that choice, then you can see that addressing climate change is actually an opportunity. Yes, it is an opportunity because we, as a human race, we can move. And in fact, we are already moving, and I'll give you some data points on that, over toward better technology. I was thinking this morning as I was preparing for this, how interesting that we moved from candles and oil lamps to electric light bulbs. And we didn't have the tra-la-la that we're having now as we're moving from fossil fuel based electric generation to renewables. Now, we did not invent light bulbs to improve candles. Candles was the technology, but we didn't go to light bulbs and say light bulbs are improved candles. No, it's a completely different technology. And what we're improving is lighting, not the candles. So what we're doing now, moving from fossil fuels to renewables, is we're improving the technology for all energy uses, not only for lighting. And so we've done this before, much smaller for sure, but we are a society that actually thrives on technological improvement and needs technological improvement. And that is what we are facing right now. We're moving away from fossil fuels that have erratic prices, completely unpredictable. They go up and down constantly, and are manipulated by unstable regimes. Fossil fuels are concentrated in a handful of countries. They're polluting locally and polluting globally. Whereas now that we're moving toward renewables energies, now we know that we can actually produce power efficiently. We can produce power at continuously falling costs because renewable energy has never been as expensive as it is right now. Tomorrow is going to be cheaper and cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. It is already today much cheaper than fossil fuels. It is not produced by erratic regimes or erratic states. In fact, it is available everywhere, in every country, in every state. So it increases energy independence. And of course, it is clean and not polluting. We are not polluting the lungs of our children. We're not polluting the atmosphere. So the fact is, renewables are on the rise and fossil fuels are on the demise simply because renewable energy is a better technology and it is cheaper. So I just wanted to lay that out really, really clearly before we go into our conversation, because I think that that fact is compelling enough to invite a mindset shift from thinking that addressing climate change is a burden, a sacrifice, or everything else, to understanding that addressing climate change could be a very interesting given opportunity to our human society to do better than what we did last century. So with that, Dan, why don't we start a free-flowing conversation? But I just wanted to put that provocative concept out there to begin with.
I love that. Thank you, Christiana. It does change our perspective. It changes our lens a little bit on how we look at these issues. So very grateful for that early and I think directional place that we should go. So along those lines, one of the biggest perceived barriers, and some would say this is an absolute barrier, but I don't think so. One of the biggest perceived barriers to climate action is money. So many institutions, including our own Catholic Church, say we must care for the environment, but it's too expensive to decarbonize. Yet the climate pledge that you helped to develop has persuaded more than 400 companies to voluntarily commit to a net zero pathway by 2040. So I guess the question is, why has this initiative been so successful? What would you say are the characteristics of those companies that help them say yes to this commitment? And what lessons could help the U.S. Catholic community, the Catholic Church, commit to net zero carbon? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, the climate pledge is successful, and we keep on adding more and more companies to this because it just makes so much sense to decarbonize. It just makes so much sense from any perspective that you look at it. And so, when we come with a proposition, well, how about you decarbonize and save money and become more energy independent and less polluting, and you're a more efficient company? Oh, who's going to say no? So that's why it's so successful. But let me take a step back down, because when we think about why we seem to be so stuck in this and why we come up with this huge resistance, let us recognize that the resistance to do the right and the smart thing by our common home has very deep roots. I would argue that caring for our shared home was put into deep question way back in the agricultural revolution, where we started to disassociate from nature, disassociate from each other, and disassociate from our shared home. Because when we shifted 10,000 BCE, when we shifted from hunter-gathering societies to agricultural ones that were settling down, that marked the beginnings of humans exerting what they conceived as control over nature. I mean, today we laugh at that, right? But that was what propelled the agricultural revolution. I, human, am going to control nature. And so we began to domesticate plants and animals, and we settled into place, and we built communities, and we began to distance ourselves from the natural world, manipulating the environment to meet our needs. Then in the 18th and 19th centuries, then we had the urbanization and the Industrial Revolution that then very quickly caused climate change because of the burning of fossil fuels and even less interaction and less exposure to natural world because we began to live in big cities, and industrialization led to increased exploitation of natural resources, and to the digging up and burning of fossil fuels. And then I would add, in the 20th and 21st centuries, what we have done there is consumer culture and materialism. And the rise of consumer culture and the emphasis on material possessions has really cemented our disconnection from nature. I would argue that we have moved from living from nature, which is what we did during the agricultural revolution, and certainly during the 18th and 19th centuries with urbanization and industrial revolution, to where we are now gratefully now, we're beginning to understand that we can no longer live from nature by exploiting, controlling nature, that we actually have to live with nature, and that we have to cease our war on our common home. And I would further argue, Dan, that because I'm an anthropologist and I look at the history of human society, I think we're actually moving toward an even more enlightened concept of our understanding of our relationship with nature, to go from living from nature, exploiting it, to living with nature, ceasing the war, to living as nature, because we are beginning to understand so much better how we can live according to natural biodiversity principles. So just from a human evolution perspective, I think we should understand it's not the fault of those of us who are alive right now. I do not point a blaming finger at him or shim or she or anybody, because this has very deep roots. That does not, however, excuse us from not doing our responsibility right now, and understanding that it is our responsibility right now to protect the commons, because the commons is what we depend on. We do not survive without the commons. We don't survive without water that comes from nature, without air that comes from nature, without food that comes from nature. We just don't survive without the commons. So we have to protect that. And then on top of that, to my very first point, Dan, just to go from the philosophical to the practical and the local, oh my gosh, these companies that are working with us under the Climate Pledge and the invitation to the Catholic community is energy efficiency is such a no-brainer, It's money saved, it's emissions saved. Why are we being so inefficient with our energy, especially in the United States? The United States has one of the highest and worst rates of energy inefficiency. Furthermore, moving over to renewable energy is simply cheaper than using fossil fuels. So from just a very practical point of view, independently of the human evolution that we have behind us, from a very practical today, right now, here and now perspective, it just makes an extraordinary amount of sense. And let me say, I believe that the US Catholic Church can and should commit to zero emissions by 2040, and that each, as an institution, and that each individual citizen can commit to being zero carbon by 2030. And we all have to do it. It's both individual and collective.
Thank you for that challenge. There are probably 100,000 buildings owned by the U.S. Catholic Church in the United States.
Hey, great potential.
Well, exactly. And what a witness that would be, right? To the wider community, to our young people who want their church to respond to this concern, which, many of them feel very, very strongly about this. Wouldn't it be wonderful if every one of those buildings committed to net zero by 2040? That would be quite an accomplishment. And as you were speaking, I was thinking about the late Senator John McCain, who way back in the mid 2000s said, what if we're wrong about climate change? What if it's not as bad as everybody says it's going to be? Well, then we've cleaned the air, we've developed new technologies, we've created new jobs, we've provided a different pathway for our children and our grandchildren. Whoops, we were wrong. So I appreciate that perspective very much.
Exactly. Well put. We were wrong, and who cares, because we did the right thing anyway.
Yeah, exactly. Great. So another question, addressing the climate emergency requires collective action. You talked about the common good, and in my view, the common good is, as you pointed out, is everyone and everything. It's all of that. But we need to reform systems and policies. In the Catholic tradition and many other traditions, we call this social justice. However, many people focus just on individual and personal actions, like turning off the lights or taking shorter showers. Why do you think it's so hard for people to think about these structural reforms? And how can we help people prioritize collective action? And it might be very interesting if you could make an analogy to your work at the UNFCCC and how you came to this moment in Paris where we got a true agreement on limiting.
Yeah. Well, I will get there, Dan, but let me start with something even simpler, because it is quite extraordinary that we are capable of doing many things collectively, and we tend to get a little idea into our head that we can't do climate collectively. So let me just give you an example, because it's not an either or, right? It's an and also. We have to do individually and collective. So team sports, for example. I'm hoping that many who are with us today are either participate in a team sport, participated, or watch sports because they're sports enthusiasts. Now, in a team sport, every single player needs to be fit and needs to practice to have his or her best performance for the game. But no individual player is going to win the game. It has to be the full team together. So why do team sports exemplify both the need for both individual preparation and commitment as well as collective performance, and yet something which is pretty simple, and we take that for granted, right? In fact, when we see a team when one player is not holding up his or her contribution, we always go, well, what's wrong with that person? Because we expect the team to work as a whole, which does not deny that every single person still needs to be fit and go to the gym and do their own training. So it is with climate. Each one of us needs to be climate fit, but we all have to work collectively to achieve something that is about protecting our common home. Another very good example, paying for insurance. Do you think that insurance companies would survive if only one of us paid for insurance? They wouldn't. Furthermore, they wouldn't even sell me an insurance. The only reason why we have insurance as a collective risk management instrument is because we all chip in with our insurance, and therefore the risk is spread across all of us. Insurance only works if we both individually play that game and if lots of us do it, because if not, it doesn't work. So we do manage risks that go beyond us. We do manage in our daily life. We do manage risks that we individually cannot control. And we do understand collective benefit in very simple day-to-day things that we do. So my question is, if we do it in our day-to-day, why can't we do it with climate? Why do we have that barrier that says, oh, I am just going to take a shorter shower? Actually, taking a shorter shower is probably a good idea anyway. But why do we think that collective action is so impossible? It isn't. It absolutely is not. It is a matter of thought. The handbrake to collective action is right here, nowhere else. So next time that thought comes up, think of a team, think of insurance, and truly try to change the mindset away from only individual to individual and collective, because we need both.
Thank you. Thank you. That was excellent. I as you were talking about the insurance analogy, though, I did just want to say that when disasters strike, I think of what's happening in Canada right now, or other places. Our hearts go out to folks, and we contribute what we can. We have Catholic Relief Services that serves 100 and something countries around the world. We have Catholic Charities USA, the network of Catholic diocesan Catholic charitable organizations. And I feel like I'm always giving money to one of those two organizations for either a disaster in the US or a disaster abroad. But a lot of people, even in this country and certainly abroad, don't have insurance. And that seems to be one of those systemic things that we have to figure out. What is what's the pool of funding that we can provide for countries that have no infrastructure, no insurance, no backstop to them? I know that there's some of that certainly in the U.S. foreign aid budget, but it's such a minimal amount. How do we get that kind of energy and compassion and even enthusiasm for those of us who have all that we need, especially nations that have all that they need, to contribute to something that is for the common good of all humanity? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I would actually first then really question whether U.S. citizens have all they need. How many U.S. citizens do not have basic health insurance?
Well, that's true. Yes.
I mean, as a Costa Rican, I cannot understand that, because we, by law, every single Costa Rican is insured by the state. In fact, everyone who lives in Costa Rica, whether you're Costa Rican or not, is insured by the state. So the fact that there's no universal health insurance in the United States is something that I frankly cannot understand. My second point, are U.S. citizens really insured against extreme weather events? I have heard just in the past 2 weeks, several insurance companies coming out to say, we will no longer insure against extreme weather events. here in the United States, because too much damage has occurred, and because there is no overall mitigating structure that is bringing the risk into manageable levels. You asked me about Paris. One of the things that got burned into my brain was 1 year before Paris, I met with all the CEOs of the major insurance and reinsurance companies of the world. And I said, tell me, what is the risk here? Because we pay insurance companies to be our risk gurus, right? That's what we pay them our money for. That's what they're experts in. They can actually quantify and manage risks. That's what they're here to do. So I said, tell me, what's the risk? Here's what they said. They said, and this is 2014, if the world goes to a temperature increase that hits 2 degrees, we will be in a systemically uninsurable world. Systemically uninsurable world. That means if we go to 2 degrees, no one will be able to get any insurance on anything, because insurance companies can no longer cover the depth of the destruction that we have wrought. So yes, we have to help others. And I live in a developing country. And yes, thank you very much for asking the question about solidarity. And it's not a but. And if we do not do our thing on climate change, no one is going to be able to be insured. No one is going to be able to be protected from those risks. The way I think about it, and now you know that I think in little pictures. So here's my analogy. We're all in the same little boat, right? We call it our common home. It's a little boat on a huge ocean. There's a hole in the boat. If we do not collaboratively close and seal the hole in that boat, it's not that only those who are sitting close to the little hole or large hole will sink. The entire boat sinks, including those who are sitting farthest away from the hole. So let's understand that, yes, solidarity is absolutely important. And thank you to His Holiness for being absolutely adamant about that. And it's not only about solidarity. It's about understanding that we're all in the same boat.
Thank you, Christiana. I'm going to maybe ask a similar question, but a little bit differently. Because I think, our audience as Catholic Climate Covenant is primarily US based. Our partners, the global Laudato Si movement, works globally. They also work in the US, but we focus almost exclusively in the United States. And in this country, as you know, because you've been educated here and have certainly spent much time here, there's this sense of this rampant individualism, right? Like everybody has to pick themselves up by their own bootstraps. There's only a sense of community when there's a crisis, but not on a day-to-day basis. I often feel. And in your book, you talk extensively about new attitudes, communal discernment, building community to build up the common good. But this notion of individualism, self-interest, personal liberty seems to be the dominant theme or dominant ethos in this country. So what advice might you give Catholics to help them convince the US society to cultivate some of these values that we need to embody in this climate crisis? How would you respond to that?
Well, Dan, I appreciate the goodwill, and I think that values that are strongly adhered to are some of the most difficult factors to change in another person. I don't know what your experience is, but anytime I've ever tried to change values in someone else, but it hasn't been very successful. So I go at it in a different way.
Okay.
I try to understand from the perspective of the person that I'm speaking to, what is important to that person. So if the wallet is important to that person, and it is to most people, then energy efficiency is your best friend. Because if you have, and I used to live in the United States in a very old home that was like a sieve when I got an energy audit, and I was heating the entire community in the winter and cooling the entire community in the summer. For what? Huge bills, eating up a whole bunch of energy unnecessarily. I did all of the energy efficiency measures in my home, at least those that made financial sense, and my electricity bill came down. Energy efficiency is your absolutely best friend if your concern is how much are you spending on energy. If your concern is, I don't know, the superiority of technologies, well, then EVs are your best friend, because fossil fuel cars are so in the museum by now, that you don't really want to be driving a fossil fuel car that is polluting every single street that you drive down and every child that lives there, that is eating up into your wallet because fossil fuel prices are completely erratic, and that requires a heck of a lot of maintenance. Whereas you could be driving an EV, especially in those states that have an incentive, and now with the new IRA law, way superior technology, less maintenance, doesn't pollute, is quiet, is a delight to drive, et cetera, et cetera. Boilers. I'm just giving you a couple of points, right? And I haven't changed the value of anybody here. How many people in the United States have these old boilers? And I say old boilers because I had one when I lived in the United States. That is also eating up a whole bunch of fuel, totally inefficient. Why do you have an old boiler? Change the darn thing to a 5-star boiler. It's wasting your money. It's wasting electricity. I mean, my point is, it's not just about the morality, right? It's because it is the smart thing to do. From a national perspective, the United States would like to keep its competitive advantage in the world, its technological and economic competitive advantage. That will only be guaranteed if the United States really goes into clean technologies in a serious way. Because China, my friends, and Europe, my friends, are going into clean technologies in a serious way. And if the United States wants to continue to be competitive and have its exports be competitive, it's going to have to invest even more into clean technologies. So with that, Dan, I just give you a short list of things that illustrate that addressing climate change is the smart thing to do, and I haven't touched your values.
It's interesting because one of the programs that we have at Catholic Climate Covenant is called Catholic Energies, and we help Catholic institutions adopt solar primarily. We do some energy efficiency work as well, and the reason why, one of the big factors in starting that program was we simply didn't feel like we were getting through to our Catholic leaders. And so we thought, if we can show them how much money they can save by doing energy efficiency or solar energy in many, many states, then we're going to save them a lot of money. And then we can say, oh, by the way, now that we've saved you $10,000, $20,000 a year on your electric bill, why don't you use this as a teachable moment for your parishioners, for the students at your school, for the retreatants who come to your retreat center? So that, I think I hear what you're saying. Let's put out the practical arguments, and maybe that will lead to some behavior change and some realization that, oh, this makes not only good financial sense, but it's also a great witness to the wider community. So thank you for that. So this conference, as you heard at the beginning, is around the Laudato Si action platform that the Vatican put out a couple years ago. One of the platform's goals is ecological economics, and our session on June 27th is going to unpack that a little bit. But from your perspective, do you think our current economic systems inhibit science-based climate action? And if so, what sort of economic reimagining is needed to address the climate crisis?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Dan, because I must admit it is one of my pet peeves. One of my pet peeves that economists are still living according to something that they learned, invented, and taught last century, which is completely wrong, completely wrong. And that is this famous externalities concept. The fact that the science of economics had the gall to decide that environmental value, not values, but value, environmental value and social value do not need to be accounted for, do not have to have a monetizable value attached to them, can actually be externalized, as they call them, these externalities, and not accounted for in any balance sheet, whether it is a private corporation balance sheet or a national balance sheet, is something that I honestly, okay, so that happened last century, but why haven't they corrected it? They know fully well that those externalities need to be internalized. We have to internalize both the value and the damage that we're doing to society, that we're doing to the environment. We have to do it. So it is one of my pet peeves. And every time I talk to an economist, I go, so how are we doing on our favorite project here? Now, the economists need to do this together, right? It's not the fault of one economist or one other. They need to do it together. And that science of economics needs to evolve very quickly, because up until that point, we are really pushing a ball up a hill. We're pushing a ball up a hill. And it's only because it's such a compelling cause that we're all working on that it is actually happening. But if economists got their act together and internalized all of those values and destruction, we would be scot-free. We would be so much more advanced than we are right now.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm going to ask you 3 more questions. And so I want to alert my colleagues to start feeding me audience questions as well. So the first one, so you led and brokered the United Nations Historic Agreement in 2015, the Paris Agreement. Almost 200 countries committed to address the climate crisis. Earlier in that year, as I know you will recall, Pope Francis published Laudato Si. And timed its release to help shape the UN negotiations that you led. What influence did Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si have on that moment, on that Paris Agreement?
Well, it's honestly difficult to find words to describe that, because the depth of gratitude that all of us felt at that moment and still feel for that encyclical, for the timing of the encyclical, for the way that it was presented, for the depth of the arguments that are presented. I mean, it was, I think the history of the Catholic Church, well, it's a long history, but in my lifetime, it's going to be written before and after Laudato Si. There's no doubt that Laudato Si put the topic of climate change, of our common home, at the very top of the attention of the huge Catholic universe, 1.3 billion Catholics around the world. No doubt that it really put the topic way up there. And what I was quite moved by in Laudato Si is that His Holiness does, I think, two things there. Well, he does many, but my two favorite is he really calls for us to heal our behavior with nature. And he really presents that relationship, which I referred to at the very beginning. And he says, look, we cannot continue that. We have to heal our relationship with nature. It is our common home. And the second thing that he does, which I was also continue to be very grateful for, you've already mentioned, Dan, he really truly understands that this is the greatest act of solidarity that we could ever have with the most vulnerable populations around the world. And he does that in such a beautiful way, so beautiful. So for both of those are, for me, the two pillars of Laudato Si: healing our relationship with nature and solidarity with the most vulnerable and with those yet unborn. Because it's not just the most vulnerable of today. It's solidarity with young people and with those yet unborn who will follow us. So for those two contributions, I am truly deeply, deeply grateful to His Holiness.
Thank you. Thank you. And I think also for me, one of the major themes in that encyclical is this notion of integral human development and integral ecology. And I think that makes that connection that we were discussing earlier, that, this is all one piece. This is all connected, right? And so how we begin to deal with the climate crisis now is going to directly impact the future and, frankly, current generations. This is
Absolutely
all connected. So let's see. I want to return. Let me just ask this question. The most recent IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, paints a very dire picture of humanity's closing window, and you talked about that early on, to avoid catastrophe. As yet in your book, you confess to being a stubborn optimist, which I love. So what do you mean by that? And what gives you hope in the face of so much apparent apathy and resistance to the changes that society needs to make? And you talked some about that, but maybe if you could help summarize that for us, it would be helpful.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. So what do I mean by stubborn optimism? First, what do I mean by optimism? I don't mean naivete. I don't mean, turning my back on science or turning my back on news about the climate events. None of that. Quite to the contrary. Absolutely understand the science, absolutely be up to date with the effects, because that is the motivating energy to do something about it. I also, with optimism, I don't mean just assume that I can just sit back and somebody else is going to take care of this. It doesn't mean irresponsibility. What I mean by optimism is the difficult, courageous choice that each of us has to make every day to say, I know that we're in a very, very, very dangerous situation. And precisely because we're in that danger, I therefore choose to do my utmost today, tomorrow, and the day after. That's optimism to me. Optimism is not the result of having achieved something. That's a celebration, and honestly, we don't celebrate enough. But optimism is not the output of having achieved something. For me, output is optimism is the input into a challenge. If I want to run a marathon and I say to myself, I don't think I'll ever be able to run a marathon, I probably won't. But if I say, I'm going to run a marathon, I'm not in shape, but I could do this and this and this and this and this. Well, now I don't guarantee that I'm going to run the marathon, but I have a better chance of doing so. So optimism is the input, the attitude with which we face a challenge. And honestly, we can only face climate change with optimism, because if we face it with apathy or with defeatism, we've lost. at the word get-go. And the reason why I put stubborn as an adjective before optimism is because we will, and we have, and we will continue to have challenges, barriers, problems, the setbacks, tra-la-la, tra-la-la. We will. And despite that, we have to be stubborn and continue, determined to continue forward. Now, where do I get my hope, you asked, in the face of, I think you said, apathy and resistance? Well, I feed my optimism by understanding that actually the changes that we need, they're already happening now. And they're not happening at a linear or gradual pace. They are exponential. So a couple of data points very quickly. According to the IEA, which is the maximum energy authority in the world, the world, will add a record 440 gigawatts of new renewable capacity this year, renewable energy. That is more than double what we added in 2019, double what the IEA, the same authority, predicted we would add in 2020. And here's the amazing thing. It's 24% more than the IEA foresaw that we were going to add just 6 months ago. So exponential growth of renewables is the new reality. This is not linear. This is exponential. Exponential gives me hope that we will be able to meet the exponential danger. Investment. 5 years ago, we invested $1 trillion into fossil fuels and $1 trillion into renewables. This year, we're still investing $1 trillion into fossil fuels, but we're investing $1.7 trillion into clean and renewable energy. Why? Because it's a better technology. It's more efficient. It's clean. It gives us energy independence. We've gone through all of those arguments already. And so that's what gives me optimism, because I can already see, and I could give you data on EVs and on hydrogen, et cetera, et cetera. We can go through all of those technologies, all of them doing the same thing, hockey stick improvement. It's no longer simply linear. It is an exponential curve. And that is incredibly exciting to me.
Thank you. That's wonderful. When you were speaking earlier about the stubborn part of stubborn optimism, I was thinking there's an old adage that if the answer is no, what it really means is that the person of whom you're asking the question really needs more information.
There you go.
So in that light, and in the fact that many of the folks on this call are talking to their pastors or their bishops or the head of their religious community and not getting very far. And so that notion of being a stubborn optimist, I think, will resonate with a lot of them. And so how do we smartly provide more information that perhaps may be more convincing? And along those lines, I want to ask a somewhat provocative question of you, and I'll just read it because I think it's best done that way. So here in the United States, faith-based nonviolent direct action has a celebrated legacy of achieving social justice when advocacy fails. So, for example, everybody knows that Reverend Martin Luther King and Reverend James Lawson secured civil rights by leading bus boycotts and lunch counter sit-ins. Today, Bill McKibben has formed The Third Way, a program that encourages the 60-plus crowd. I am one of those.
Me too.
To put their wisdom and sometimes their bodies on the line as they demonstrate for climate action. So the question is, do you think this is a crisis that calls for a sustained campaign of nonviolent direct action? Are we at that point?
Absolutely, yes, I do. And history shows actually that transformational social and political changes only occur when public opinion shifts. And so I do think that nonviolent action, demonstration on the streets, whatever, is important. That's, Vietnam, very good example. Civil rights, very good example. Women's rights, very good example. Apparently, we need that kind of pressure. And so I am very grateful to all of those who go out there. My great friend, Bill McKibben, God bless him. He's just never going to give up. And I do think that it is important. I don't think it's the only thing that we can do for a couple of reasons. A, because not everybody feels comfortable with that kind of action, right? So my answer to your question, Dan, is yes, absolutely, for those who are comfortable with that. And from a holistic point of view, that is one component that is really important. And there are some growing number of both youth and not so youth that feel comfortable in doing that. Bless you. Thank you very much for doing it. We also need those who are going to be working on the policy side. We also need those who are working on technology advancement. We also need those who are working on shifting the finance. We also need those who are working on better communications, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, for me, nonviolent direct action is one very important piece of a bigger puzzle. Mm-hmm. It's very important, but it is not in and of itself. It cannot be the only thing that we do.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm done with my questions. The audience will be thrilled. So I'll start asking some of theirs. One question that came in is, much of the clean energy technology relies on minerals that are mined in the developing countries. They displace indigenous populations and cause tremendous pollution and environmental degradation. So witnessed last week's protest in Brazil by indigenous people to the latest legislation opening their home areas to gold mining, which we need for electronics and other things. So how would you respond to, obviously we can't keep burning fossil fuels because we're going to cook the planet, but there are also these pretty awful incidences of mining cobalt and some of the other minerals around the world that are really exploiting populations, indigenous, low-income communities particularly. What do we do about that?
And I think there are two issues there, Dan, that are separable just to think about them, although they're not separate. Sure. One is the mining of these rare elements, of which gold is not one, but many of the rare elements that are necessary, for example, for solar and for wind technologies. We will continue to improve those technologies. In fact, many of those rare elements are now being used at 15% of what they were being used for the same technology just 5 or 10 years ago, because we have understood that we can't depend on unlimited extraction of those. So I think that we will develop technological improvements that will require less and less of those rare elements. So that's and there are quite a few examples of that. So that's good news. The other piece that is separable but not separate are all of the social and cultural implications of the extraction of these. And that is not associated with the extraction of the minerals. That is associated with our lack of values, our lack of a moral backbone, and the fact that we think that we as humans can be as abusive against other human beings as we have been abusive against nature. So that's not the fault of the cobalt. That's not the fault of the lithium. That's the fault of who we think we are. And that, Dan, really needs much more. That doesn't have a technological fix, right? The first piece has a technological fix, or at least a technological improvement. This one does not. And I actually think that climate change is what I call the gym of our social responsibility. It is through addressing climate change, I hope, that we are challenged with all of these issues that we see that are interlaced, and that we recognize, as young people call it, the intersectionality of all of these issues, and are really beginning to grapple with that complexity. And thank the Lord that we are. It is about time. It is about time. So I don't think that there is a perfect fix. I don't think that there is, the magical solution, but I am grateful that they are all on the table and that they're getting more and more attention, as they should.
Amen. Amen. Here's another question. They're coming fast and furious, so I'm afraid I'm not going to get to all of them. But so children and teens around the world are organizing for collective action on behalf of climate change. So what, in your opinion, is wrong with us as adults? And why is our government, corporate, and religious leadership seemingly so lacking in strong leadership and role modeling on this?
Who is lacking in leadership? Sorry, the U.S.?
Well, besides, with the exclusion of you and me, of course, governmental, corporate, and religious leadership. Why they're not, they don't seem to have the same sense of urgency or feel a sense of agency that they can do anything about that. So we have young people who are very engaged and very animated by this issue, but we have adults like ourselves who seem to be less inclined to do something. What's behind that, I think, is what the question.
What's behind the generational gap? Is that what you're saying?
I think that's what's behind the question. Yeah.
Well, it's a very good question. I think what's behind the generational gap is a couple of things. First of all, the next generation after me, my children and everyone who is, I don't know, younger than, let's say, 30s, were already born into a changed world. And they know that everything that is being done right now is going to affect them directly for the rest of their lives. When you and I were 20 and 30, we didn't have that realization because it just wasn't with us. But these kids know, and I don't say kids with any lack of respect, that's what I call my own kids. These kids know that I am so impressed with the way that they have studied the science, with the way that they have studied the arguments, with the way that they engage with policy people, with decision makers. They really know their stuff. And they don't want to put up with sad excuses from those in our generation who honestly have to excuse themselves from doing whatever they're doing or not doing. So I think that's the difference in the generations, that those young people know that this is going to affect them the rest of their life, and that we in our generation feel, well, maybe it's far away, maybe it's not so bad, maybe we can still get away with it. We don't feel the pressure of now. We don't feel the pressure on our entire life. And that's really sad, Dan. That is really sad, because I tell you one thing. My parents did not have, and their whole generation, they did not have the science, the technologies, or the finance as a world, that generation, to solve this. So we can say, okay, we're not going to lay responsibility on those shoulders. Those who are 30 and younger, by the time they get to the decision tables, that will be after 2030, for them, it's going to be too late. So for the generation before me, it was too early. For the generation after me, it's going to be too late. The generation that needs to change the direction is our generation, for heaven's sakes, our generation. we need to stand up to our responsibility. We need to understand that there is a moral imperative, that there is a technological imperative, that there's an economic imperative, that all of these imperatives are actually aligned, and we need to take those decisions. I do not agree with those who say, thank God for the young people, they're going to save us. I'm sorry. That is cowardice in my book. Yes, they will still continue to work on solutions because we're not going to have, a magical solution right away. But we need to turn this ship around. Sorry, Dan, I feel very, very passionate about that. The generational gap and the injustice that we're doing on young people is, to me, the piece. That's why I work on climate change, because of the injustice on future generations. Therefore, whoever asked that question has pressed my button, and thank you for doing that.
I just wish you'd show a little more passion when you talk about it.
Yeah, okay. I'll have some water.
That would be helpful, yeah. So I mean, there's a bunch of questions. I'm gonna just give you two of them, and it has to do with this sense of urgency, and I think a sense of hopelessness. So one says, it seems that all the deadlines promised by governments and companies exceed the 2030 deadline of closing the closing of the window. To what degree do you think we must accept that irreversible damage is guaranteed? So that's one question. Let me combine that with this other one. The focus on avoiding a 1.5 degree rise has not been effectively communicated to the people about the perils of climate change. Today, people are experiencing droughts, wildfires, more violent weather, flooding, sea level rise, and so forth, and are starting to understand what climate change really is. In your experience, does communicating the horrors of climate change inspire action or cause people to fearfully shut down and ignore the emergency? So, well, one question is, communicating, and in the first chapter of your book, it's very ugly because you talk about what if we did nothing. So there's that question, and then the other question is, are we at a point where we have to begin to accept some degree of damage that it's almost guaranteed?
Yes.
Yes to the first question.
Yeah, and yes to the second also. I think one of the very bitter pills that we all have to swallow is that we are never going to solve climate change. When I read that verb in front of climate change, I always go like, seriously, how are you going to do that? It's too late for that, Dan. We're never going to solve climate change. That is a bitter pill. But we have to stand up courageously to that reality. We're too late to solve climate change. The opportunity that we have is to avert the worst impacts of climate change. You can tell me that's not a nice enough or a compelling enough incentive. Well, it better be, because the worst of climate change is unthinkable. So we're not going to solve climate change. We're very dangerously close to 1.5. I totally agree that we have not internalized the dangers of going beyond 1.5. Every 10th of a degree counts. Every 10th of a degree is very likely millions and millions more people into abject poverty, if not into death. It's not simply a little number. It's the impact on humanity. So we have to make our absolute darndest. We're not going to solve it, but we can avert the worst.
Thank you. One last question. Can you provide some examples of how individuals can quickly get to net zero emissions? What is it that we can do individually to get to that? And
yeah. Yay. Okay. Number one, go to Miss Google, because in my book, she's a myth. Whoa. That was amazing lightning. Okay, go to Miss Google and put in carbon calculator, for example. And you will get a whole list of all very reputable NGOs that have pretty simple to use carbon calculator, because your first step is figure out what your carbon footprint is. Figure it out for yourself, for your family, for your city, for whoever you want. So number one, diagnosis. What is my carbon footprint? The very same, if it's a good application, it probably is, the very same exercise will tell you where your deepest footprint is. Mm-hmm. Where are you most? And that then turns into your action plan. So if your deepest footprint is that stupid boiler that you have down there in the basement, well, change the boiler. If your deepest footprint is your transport, well, change your transport. If your deepest footprint is, I don't know, and the heating and cooling of your house, well, put in some insulation. So we can't get to net zero right away, but all of us can reduce our footprint by figuring out where is it that we have most of our emissions. And most of our emission reductions will make an extraordinary amount of sense to us. They will not be a burden. That's the good news. There is a threshold beyond which it no longer makes, let's say, economic sense. And then you have to make a choice. Do you want to invest into that or not? But before you get there, there's a heck of a lot that you can do. So figure that out, get your diagnosis, and get a plan together and commit to yourself that you are going to be carbon neutral as an individual, as a family, as a school, as a church, as a diocese, as whatever boundary you want by 2030. Honestly, we can all do it. We can all do it.
Yeah.
Mindset.
Thank you. Yeah. And I guess I will add to that, if you don't mind. Let's look at where our energy comes from. That's that scope 2, what's coming into the building, right? So can we purchase renewable energy? And if all of us were to do that, that's a collective action that's going to push the electric generation market into more renewables. And we can do that in our parishes and in our churches and encourage that type of, I know in the Archdiocese of Washington, for example, there's a contract that the Archdiocese has signed to purchase renewable energy at the same cost, and I think it might be slightly lower than traditional coal-fired power plant energy. So
yeah, it probably is lower.
And collective actions as well as the individual actions.
Absolutely. And honestly, the United States is so blessed now with the IRA, with the Inflation Reduction Act, yes, that the Biden administration has passed through, because it really turns the tables on climate action and provides many financial incentives as well as moral to do the right thing. So, definitely look at that law and see where you can take advantage of it, because that's the whole point of it.
Yeah.
Not everyone has that luxury. And the fact that the IRA, I must say, U.S. citizens should be incredibly proud about that law, because not only is it a climate law, but it is also a social justice law. Amen. And that is impressive. The fact that they were able to do that is very impressive, and all U.S. citizens should be proud of it and should be using it as its fullest.
Great. Thank you, Christiana. Let me see. I'm going to share my screen once again and begin to wrap this up. So are we seeing this? This has to move, so I can do slideshow. All right, we there? You can see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So anyway, thank you, Christiana. This has been a robust and fascinating conversation. As I said earlier, my only regret is that you don't have more enthusiasm for this.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. I'll try to garner some more.
And as I monitor my Venmo account here, waiting for that big influx of money for promoting your book, let me turn to some coming attractions. So in the weeks ahead, we're going to tackle all 7 of the Laudato Si Action Platform goals. Each session is going to feature leaders from academia and from on-the-ground practitioners living out these goals. I guarantee you that you will be engaged and informed, so I encourage everyone on this call and those who couldn't make it tonight to certainly join us in these weeks ahead. Our next session is a week from tonight, the same time, same station, 8 o'clock. We're going to look at the goal response to the cry of the poor. The Zoom link you use tonight will be the same one for all sessions. Is that right, Paz? Can you confirm that for me? I wrote that in my notes, but I'm not sure it's true.
Yes.
Okay, yes, okay. So we're going to see you next week. Again, I want to thank Father Hendrickson and Creighton University, my colleagues, Dan DeLeo from Creighton, Elena Gaona, and Paz Artaza-Reagan for your help tonight. I was juggling multiple screens trying to get all the questions in my head. Not sure I was successful, but anyway, but I especially want to thank you, Christiana, for your global leadership, for your willingness to impart so much wisdom for us tonight, and for you as a human being and as an inspiring leader. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, and congratulations to everything that you are doing as a community of faith.
Thank you so much. And then we're going to close with a prayer in a second, but I also wanted to thank all of you for joining tonight, for being part of this conversation. It has truly inspired me, and I hope it has you. And again, let's applaud Christiana for her wisdom. So the schedule that you see is the next few sessions, but let us close with prayer as we opened with prayer, and then after the prayer, that will be the end of our meeting tonight, so you can sign off. So here we go. This is from a prayer I got from Kafod, and let's again take a moment to quiet ourselves, to take a breath, to be hopeful, to be stubbornly optimistic that we can tackle this. You said, "Let there be," and so there was. Creation awakened, reaching towards you, life sang your praises. Each seed, each atom replied to your calling. Each plant, each creature, knowing, unasking. You said, "Let them live." And so we did. Creation, abundant, reaping the harvest, called to your table. Each man, each woman joined in the feasting. Each son, each daughter, praising, rejoicing. You said, "Let them share." And how we fail. Creation, unbalanced, wasting, destroying. We take from others, keeping, withholding. We fail to notice each man, each woman, hungering, weeping. We say, "Let us learn." And so we must. Creation restored, giving and taking, to each life sufficient, each to another, filled with your bounty, each prayer, each answer, building, remaking. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you all, and have a great evening.
Thank you.